Welcome, Ned Kelly Gang, to another episode of Australian Crime Stories. We hope you enjoy this early access episode, uninterrupted. In June 1979, the quiet suburb of Parkside was rocked by a chilling discovery. A prominent barrister found dead, concealed inside a freezer in his own home. The case that followed gripped South Australia, weaving together a tangled web of secrets, complex relationships, and shadowy figures. What seemed at first like a straightforward murder quickly unraveled into a mystery filled with unanswered questions and disputed evidence, and a young man's life forever changed. This is the story behind one of the state's most infamous murder trials. Uncover the dark corners of this unique country with our next chapter. Body in the freezer. This is Australian Crime Stories. Tuesday, 5th of June, 1979. The house on Greenhill Road stood still. It was an eccentric home known for its unique modern style, representing that of a collapsed tent. It was referred to as
that weird house on Greenhill Road.
It was the home and legal office of Derrance Stevenson, an Adelaide criminal barrister known for his sharp courtroom style and flamboyant personality. He sported 2 gold earrings in his left ear, drove a flashy red sports car, and often took on unusual clients. Bikies knew him well and referred to him as Barbie Doll. It was unlike Derrance to miss court, so when he failed to appear at work on Tuesday, it raised eyebrows. Colleagues and acquaintances tried calling. There was no answer. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, police were contacted and dispatched to the property. They knocked and rang, but got no response. They circled the house, peering through windows. Nothing. Eventually, they entered. There was no sign of forced entry. Inside, the house appeared neat. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, and no sign of Derrance anywhere. A large, white-lidded freezer tucked away inside the rear room of the home office caught their attention. The lid had been glued shut, sealed with a thick application of adhesive that someone had deliberately applied. Suspicion turned to certainty. Police fetched tools and forced the lid open. A wave of cold mist escaped as the seal cracked. Inside, curled unnaturally in the fetal position, was a half-dressed human body. The corpse was identified as Derrance Stevenson, age 48. A bullet hole marked the back of his head, the clear cause of death. Police noted that there were no defensive wounds on the body. It appeared Derrance had been shot at close range, presumably while unaware from behind. Head of Major Crime, Ken Thorson, arrives at the crime scene. Dr. Colin Manock, Chief Forensic Officer, has moved Derrance's partially frozen body onto the bed in what he thinks to be the position of death, face down. They confirm the murder weapon is a .22 caliber rifle that they believe was owned by Derrance. He was a gun enthusiast with 2 rifles mounted to the wall of his bedroom. He even had a customized number plate for his car that read Gun 045. They begin questioning neighbors and those who knew him. No gunshot was heard during the night. They learn of David Sack, a 19-year-old young man with blonde hair who lives with Derrance and is believed to be his partner. He was seen just after 5 p.m. the day before, driving Derrance's red Datsun. An accountant also says he sees David leave the house at around 6:30 p.m. A friend of Derrance's states that Derrance confided that he had grown tired of David and had given him his marching orders, buying him a bus ticket to Coober Pedy. Derrance himself made 2 phone calls on Monday, one at 4:40 p.m. to his friend Mark Lawrence, another just before 6 p.m. to his other friend Gino Gambardella. They interview Gino. He confirms they talked on the phone and that Derrance was supposed to come over to Gino's for dinner at 7:30 p.m. When he never showed, Gino says he drove past his home to check if he was there.
It was a case of no car, no Derrance. I kept driving.
However, this doesn't match what witnesses reported. They saw Gino's car parked outside Derrance's house throughout the night up until around 11 p.m., along with another car. Police also learned that a taxi driver picked up a man from the property that night just past 11 p.m. The driver described the passenger as young and with blonde hair. He was carrying a black garbage bag with something inside. When he dropped him at Rundle Mall, he left the bag behind.
Oi, you've missed something.
The boy comes back to pick it up, mumbling.
That's the most important bit.
The description of the young man matches David's, but the taxi driver believes the man he picked up was not David. There's another report of a young man who had burst into Legal Services Commission on Tuesday morning at around 8:15 a.m, prior to opening hours. When asked by the secretary if he has a solicitor, he responds,
Yes, Derrance Stevenson. But when I saw him last night, he was in no condition to talk to anyone.
This young man also had blonde hair. Was he the same person who caught the taxi? Back at the crime scene, Dr. Manick conducts his autopsy and establishes the time of death of Derrance Stevenson between 5:45 p.m. and 6:40 p.m. According to witnesses, David was at the house during this time. The police believe this was a crime of passion, with their prime suspect being David Zack, who was still nowhere to be seen, along with Derrance's red Dustin. On that same Tuesday, David is found with Derrance's missing red Datsun. The night prior, he had driven 850 kilometers north to the opal mining town of Coober Pedy. He was spotted fueling up at a petrol station midway on his journey. The exact time he was seen has been disputed. In Coober Pedy, he was seen reportedly showing off. If the red sports car wasn't enough to gain anyone's attention, Derrance's large opal ring and flashy clothes that David wore certainly did. He would often wear Derrance Stevenson's clothes as they were seamed with his initials, which of course matched David Zack's initials too. That's Zack with an S. David tries calling Derrance that morning, but gets no response. He then calls Derrance's secretary, who tells him he's missing. At around 12 p.m, he goes to Coober Pedy police station. He says he was going there to settle some checks he bounced, but no matter the reason, he starts talking about his friend Derrance, saying that he tried to call him and was concerned he was missing. Detective Mick Standing, who was present, knew Derrance as he would often visit Coober Pedy on business himself. Seeing a young man in his clothes and jewellery and driving his car, Detective Standing immediately became suspicious. He interviews David before arresting him for stealing Derrance's car. David continues his concern for Derrance, saying,
Please find him. He is all I have.
Coober Pedy soon hears of Derrance's murder and that the young man they've arrested, David Zack, is the prime suspect. David is transported back to Adelaide. In early interviews, police pressed David on what happened on Monday, 4th of June. He tells them his version of events. It was around 9 a.m. that Derrance went to work. David was at his place, and because he didn't have work, he would sleep in late. At around 2:40 p.m, Derrance comes home, and that's when David woke. They had tea and fruitcake. Around 5 p.m, Derrance asks David to take his car and go get some milk. After his return, Derrance, without warning, tells David to abandon the plans to take the bus to Coober Pedy. Derrance was supposed to drop him there, but tells him to instead take his car, saying,
Go now.
David does so. He drives his red Datsun to the bus station to cash in the ticket. Then he goes to his parents' house for a moment on his way back to Derrance's. He says that he wanted to go back to double-check that Derrance wanted him to take the car to Coober Pedy. He arrives back at the house at around 8 p.m, but couldn't find Derrance. He cleans up the sauces from the afternoon tea before getting in the car and driving to Coober Pedy through the night. David also mentions that a week earlier, on arriving home from a night out, he overheard Derrance on the phone saying, the police also charged Gino Gambardella with being an accessory corroborated by other friends, however, who stated for some reason mentioned wanting to get out of something that he described as disappears with his two children in February 1980. Police weren't buying his story. Children, his wife. They have eyewitnesses putting David at the house up until 6:30 trying to find them in Europe. More crucially, and later talked the forensic pathologist working the case, Dr. Colin Manock, provided police with an estimated time of death between 5:45 p.m. and 6:40 p.m. That estimation puts David, and only David, at the crime scene at the time of the murder. It was enough for them. David was formally charged with murder and refused bail. He was remanded in custody, awaiting trial despite maintaining his innocence. The police also charged Gino Gambardella with being an accessory after the fact, opposing bail on several grounds. Mysteriously, though, he disappears with his two children in February 1980. Children his wife, Mary, had custody of. Mary spends years trying to find them in Europe and later talked about her husband stating,
He had film material and equipment and made pornographic films in the bedroom of his home. He used teenagers in those films.
How Gino was able to flee internationally with two children he didn't have custody of whilst also facing charges remains a disturbing mystery. For David, there was no option of fleeing. All he could do was face the trial before him. The Supreme Court of South Australia was packed when David Szach stood trial for murder in late 1979. On one side sat the Crown prosecutors, confident in their theory. On the other, the defence team representing a 19-year-old accused of killing his mentor, lover, and guardian. It was a trial that held the public's attention, not just for its gruesome details, but for its hints of scandal. Derrance Stevenson had been a respected figure, a criminal barrister with elite clients and a sophisticated social circle. But in death, he became the subject of whispered revelations about his sexuality, about his relationships with young men, and about what went on behind the closed doors of his Greenhill Road home. At the centre of the Crown's case was a timeline and a single, definitive point anchoring it. That point came from Dr. Colin Manock, the state's chief forensic pathologist, who testified that Derrance had been killed between 5:45 p.m. and 6:40 p.m. on Monday, 4th June 1979. That timing was critical. It was not based on an eyewitness, nor on a confession, but on scientific estimation, specifically the temperature of Derrance's liver and the state of fluids in the body before it froze. Dr. Manock claimed to have taken a thermometer reading from the liver through the freezer lining and applied a mathematical formula to determine how long the body had been dead before freezing. Based on this calculation, the prosecution argued that Derrance must have been shot just before the body was frozen, meaning the murder occurred before David left the house. The Crown presented the relationship between David and Derrance as fractured. They described tensions between them, including jealousy and alleged threats from Derrance that David would be kicked out or replaced by another young man. Prosecutors framed the crime as one of emotional volatility, that David, fearing abandonment, had acted in anger and panic. They pointed to David's behaviour after the murder, taking Derrance's red Datsun, driving north, and checking into a motel under his real name in Coober Pedy. To the jury, This looked like a flight from guilt. The defense, meanwhile, painted a different picture. They argued that David had no motive to kill Derrance. Their relationship, while complicated, was never violent. David had not tried to hide his identity while traveling, and he had shown no signs of panic. The defense cast doubt on whether the time of death could be pinpointed so precisely, and warned the jury that the forensic science was far from exact. But they had a major problem. Dr. Manock's testimony went unchallenged by any independent forensic pathologist during the trial. At the time, his conclusions were rarely questioned. The defense lacked the resources, or perhaps the expertise, to bring in a second opinion. The jury accepted his evidence as authoritative. After a 22-day trial, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder. David was sentenced to life imprisonment, later adjusted to a non-parole period of 18 years. The courtroom emptied, and the public moved on. But years later, long after the verdict was handed down and forgotten by many, the trial would haunt the justice system. The very forensic testimony that secured David's conviction would later be discredited. At trial, Dr. Manock's testimony had appeared decisive. He told the jury that he had inserted a thermometer into Derrance's liver through the lining of the freezer and calculated the time of death using a formula derived from standard forensic literature. That time aligned suspiciously with when David had admitted being at the house. But years later, as forensic science advanced and scrutiny of historical convictions grew, a troubling question emerged. Was the science even valid? In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Dr. Manock's methods began to unravel. Several of his autopsies were found to be riddled with errors, some of them so severe they resulted in wrongful convictions, most notably in the case of Henry Keogh, who spent nearly 20 years in prison before his conviction was quashed. David's case, once considered open and shut, was suddenly reopened in the court of public opinion. Expert pathologists who reviewed the Stevenson case in the 2000s and 2010s were blunt in their assessments. Dr. Manock had no scientific basis for his conclusion about the time of death. Dr. Manock never dissected the body or removed it from the freezer before forming his conclusion. He used a liver thermometer reading taken through the freezer wall, a method widely condemned as unreliable. The formula he used for calculating the time of death was designed for ambient conditions, not for a body already being artificially frozen. He also added a random 40% adjustment to his calculations that holds no rationality. According to forensic pathologist Dr. Harry Harding, the process Manock used was not just flawed, it was scientifically impossible. In a cold environment, like a sealed freezer, the usual cooling process of a body is drastically altered. Any temperature readings, particularly when taken from the outside of the body, would be wildly unreliable. Without a valid time of death, the prosecution's neatly constructed timeline crumbled. If Derrance Stevenson had been killed after David left the house, then the entire premise of the Crown's case collapsed. The man who once stood trial as a 19-year-old with blonde hair and a shy, unreadable face is now older, thinner, and frail. David Sack, now in his 60s, lives with the degenerative and terminal illness motor neurone disease. He no longer fights for freedom. He fights for vindication. After serving 14 years for the 1979 murder of Derrance Stevenson, David has spent much of his post-prison life trying to prove he did not do it. His health is failing, but his determination has never wavered. The conviction, he believes, was based on flawed forensic evidence and a narrative the system never wanted to question. In 2013, the South Australian Parliament passed new laws allowing people convicted of serious crimes to appeal again, if fresh and compelling evidence came to light. David's legal team believed his case fit that test. They argued that Dr. Colin Manock's testimony, the very cornerstone of the 1979 conviction, had since been discredited by numerous experts and disavowed by advancements in forensic science. The appeal relied not on new theories, but on undeniable scientific reality, that Manock's methods had no foundation in accepted pathology. But the path forward has been anything but smooth. Despite meeting the criteria for appeal, David's application for legal aid was rejected, repeatedly. The justification: he was no longer in custody and thus not at risk of further punishment. In other words, the system said, "You're free now. Let it go." To David and his supporters, this was not only unjust, it was a betrayal of the very principle of justice. The fact that he had already served his sentence should not be a reason to deny him a hearing. His case has been taken up by prominent advocates for criminal justice reform, including Dr. Bob Moles, who specializes in miscarriages of justice. Moles has called the David conviction one of the most serious legal failures in South Australian history. Civil Liberties Australia also backs the appeal, noting that the state's refusal to provide legal aid amounts to an effective blockade against clearing a man's name, even in the face of overwhelming forensic doubt. Meanwhile, the case remains technically unresolved. David's application for a second appeal is in limbo. Without funding, it cannot progress through the courts. Without progress, the conviction stands. And with time slipping away, David is likely to die before any legal resolution is reached. Still, his fight continues, carried by his lawyers, his advocates, and those who believe that science, not speculation, should determine a person's guilt or innocence. In media interviews, David has spoken only occasionally. But when he does, the tone is consistent. Not angry, not bitter, but clear.
I didn't do it.
He has said.
I have lived with this too long. I want to be heard. I want people to know the truth.
And the truth, many now believe, is that a young man may have been sent to prison on the back of a forensic fiction, a guess dressed up as science, delivered by a man whose professional record has since collapsed under scrutiny. Whether justice will ever be done is uncertain. But one thing is now clear. The foundation on which that original conviction was built has long since cracked. One of the biggest questions around this case is whether it was the unofficial beginning of the tragic family murders. Multiple young boys and men who were drugged, assaulted, and killed in Adelaide. The only other named suspect of Derrance's murder, Gino Gambardella, was no ordinary chiropractor. He was a regular presence in Adelaide's gay scene in the late 1970s, with a reputation for procuring young men, and even boys, under the guise of modelling or chiropractic work. He was also a confidant of Derrance Stevenson, and, more disturbingly, an associate of Bevan Spencer von Einem, the only man ever convicted for the family murders. Multiple witnesses tie him to a world of pornography, drug exploitation, and underage abuse. It's highly believed that himself and Derrance were involved in producing and selling child pornography. On the night Derrance died, Gino's distinctive green and white car was spotted in the driveway, and police even briefly charged him as an accessory before dropping the case with him fleeing to Italy. There is almost no doubt that Gino was involved in the murder of Derrance. Was Derrance wanting to get out of their depraved business? Could Gino not let him? Then we have the mysterious young men or man who appeared in the taxi and at the Legal Aid Commission. He said in reference to Derrance,
When I left him last night, he was in no condition to act for anyone.
He vanished before authorities could identify him. Based on his comments, he would have been the last person to have seen Derrance alive. Described with blonde hair, many suspect this man was Alan Barnes, the first victim of the family murders. Alan was a 16-year-old boy who went missing only weeks after Darrence's murder. He was friends with a boy named Darko, who worked as Gino's receptionist and would often help him lure young men and boys. Darko was also friends with David. Alan was also using Derrance as a solicitor for a rape accusation from his ex-girlfriend. It was a web of connections. Did Alan know something that he shouldn't have? Was he present for the murder? And was he the boy in the taxi? We may never get the answers. However, the connections that Derrance Stevenson had to the family murders, big or small, is undeniable. Was this murder the start of the horrific family murders? What exactly were Derrance and Gino involved in before one of them dies and the other flees? How did David and Derrance meet? And more importantly, at what age? Follow Crime Unearthed to be notified of our latest deep dive into this week's case, Body in the Freezer. Coming this week, exclusive to subscribers. Thank you, Ned Kelly Gang, for listening to another episode of Australian Crime Stories. This has been Body in the Freezer.